My name's Nick Wallis. I produce a radio show in Melbourne called Enpsychedelia, which focuses on drug issues and has done for 4 years. So this will be recorded and rebroadcast on that, hopefully tomorrow, if the technology cooperates. And we've been talking about some pretty cyclical issues that have been going around and around, not much solution coming from them, even though the problems are fairly clear. Some of those issues are things like sniffer dogs, pill testing, cannabis regulation, medical cannabis, and the problems with the regulatory models that have been put forward. But one of the big ones is the roadside drug testing scheme that currently operates across Australia in various different iterations, more or less the same, slightly different per state. I think a lot of states recently introduced a doubling of the penalty and have tried to make that an automatic thing. But as you are probably all aware, there's a problem with the roadside drug testing scheme in that it does not detect or determine the difference between impairment and detection. So that's what we're going to focus on today with our panellists. And I think we've got everyone here except we were going to have David Shoebridge, but he's had to go and do other things. So maybe can we go start at my far left, and we'll go along and get just a quick introduction from each of our panellists.
Hello. My name's Andrew Kavasilas. Been involved with the Hemp Embassy for about 20 odd years in advocacy and activism, and in relation to saliva testing, we've been kind of onto it from the very start, and been warning the government what would happen if they introduced a dodgy strategy.
Hello, Sally McPherson, crazy dog lady. Solicitor in the area, working in crime, and have a particular interest in medicinal cannabis and its very slow rollout across the country.
My name is Steve Bolt. I'm a solicitor too, lawyer. I'm Lismore based, so that's not far from here if people don't know. And I've been involved with the issues around drug law reform for a long, long time, 30 years or something scary like that when I think about it, and been involved with the Hemp Embassy for about 20-something years. So anyway, and I've also run quite a few cases about this particular offensive offence of driving with the presence of THC and a few other drugs.
I'm Fiona Patten. I'm a Member of Parliament in Victoria, and I've certainly been trying to change the way we do our roadside drug testing, and particularly presence versus impairment, and specifically and most importantly for me at the moment is around medicinal cannabis users and those, absolutely those that have a prescription. I just was looking at my website. It looks like I've mentioned it over the last 4 years about 22 times.
Andrew Katelaris, I'm a health practitioner. I oppose the saliva drug testing as a callous backdoor way of interfering with the widespread application of medical cannabis. Right? There is not a single example of greater hypocrisy by our governments, right, than to push legal opioids, which are now killing more people than all illegal drugs combined, and yet harass people with medical needs off the roads.
My name's Adela Falk. I'm from the States. I work with the organization called POW 420, which has a lot to do with people getting arrested for simply using, possessing, and driving under the influence of cannabis, spread awareness about it, and talk to people about their rights and help educate them so they don't get in the situation of having to take a DUI in the United States of America.
So a round of applause for our panellists this afternoon. Thank you. So a quick little history on where the roadside drug testing scheme came from in Australia. So it was introduced in the mid-2000s after some research at Swinburne University in Victoria. I've actually been in contact with that researcher lately as well, because there were two pieces of research that led to the roadside drug testing scheme. That was one piece of research on the Secure Tech, which is the technology, the tongue scraper that they use. And what they discovered in that research is that, yes, it can detect certain drugs. So they tested it. It was already a commercial property. They'd already done all that testing. So they sort of did it again. Yes, it works. And then they got a bunch of people high on various amounts of drugs and then got them behind a driving simulator and said, yep, you guys are too fucked to drive. But there was never any meshing of those two pieces of research, because what they found with the Secure Tech is that, yes, they can detect a amount of a drug at some point. And what they found was that, yes, you can make people really impaired if you put drugs in them in a scientific experiment until they can't drive anymore. But if you don't know what the amounts are or anything like that, then it doesn't really match up. But that's where this all started. So it began there. And then it spread across the country. As you know, testing for cannabis, methamphetamine and MDMA, and now cocaine in New South Wales only. And they're ramping it up every year. I'm not sure on New South Wales, but I think in Victoria it's 100,000 tests or something. So maybe because I know we've got a bit of, on the panel, we've got some people who have represented people in court. Maybe we can start with hearing some of the stories of how this scheme affects people.
Am I on? Yes. Yes, I might say a few things, and I think Sally might say a few things as well on the very same subject. The basic overview of the law in New South Wales, and identical almost in other states, is the offence we're talking about is to drive with the presence of one of the nominated drugs, THC. It's not cannabis, it's THC expressed in the legislation, in saliva, or blood or urine, but they only test for saliva, test your saliva. So the swab, simple enough process. The cops stop you. They've got a power to stop a vehicle and require a swab. They take a swab. If that's positive, they take you to a bus around here these days, or a police station. Do a different test. They take then a sample of saliva, stick it into a machine called a Dragar machine. They get a result, positive or negative. Either way, the main thing is that sample goes to Sydney to be analysed at a laboratory. The analyst writes a certificate to say there's something present or not in that sample. 97% are positive. THC is a very, very common one. And the middle stage doesn't really matter in a way. If it's positive at the police station or the bus, you'll give a prohibition of driving for 24 hours, so you can't drive for 24 hours. But that's it. You don't get a charge later until it comes back from the lab. You go to court, the charge is drive with the presence of. There's thousands of them, 8,000 odd last year figures available 2017, just almost 8,600, 800 or something, almost 8,000 charges. About a third of those maybe no conviction recorded as a result, so that's pretty good statistics I think about what happens. A lot of people get off as a first offence because you get the benefit of a good record, etc., and then you don't lose your licence. But on conviction, you lose your licence for a minimum of 3 months, and second offence, you lose your licence for a minimum of 6 months, maximum as well. The otherwise penalty, that's a fine, you can't go to jail, it's just a regulatory offence in other ways. So almost everybody pleads guilty because the offence is to drive, or you're the driver, with THC present in your saliva. Well, there it is, the lab says it's present. They measure at the lab, the cut-off level for the reporting level that they give back to for the lab is 10 nanograms of THC per millilitre. There's a lot of some issues about that, about how oversensitive that is in terms of what they measure. The science that supports it basically says that the prosecution rely on in these cases that we have arguments about in court, says that should be for THC up to about 12 hours before it is detectable at that level. Anecdotally, we don't think that's anything like the truth, but nonetheless, that's what the science says. And on that basis, the Centre for Road Safety has a website that says, on average, a typical cannabis smoker would be clear of THC after 12 hours. In their saliva. Blood, urine, different, okay, but in saliva, okay? So I recommend that everyone present who's a driver of a vehicle in New South Wales consult their Google Centre for Road Safety, look at the little page about drug testing and so on. It gives you the information that the government tells you about it, and that is the entire source of information you'll get from the New South Wales government since this scheme has been in place for I don't know how many years. Aside from those TV ads, the short videos which have flashing lights, and the message is, we will catch you, we will catch you, we will catch you, and that is the message. Anyway, the only defence to the charge, because most people plead guilty, it's mostly a lot of first offence, there's a lot of no conviction, so you keep your licence. If you get charged again, or you have a prior offence in the last 5 years, you can't do that. You can't get off without a conviction, so you must lose your licence. So there's a lot of people who do lose their licence, and that's a very, very significant impact, of course, on everybody's life. So 3/4 of people lose their licence on the statistics. Sorry, two-thirds of people, roughly, would lose their licence on the statistics. Sorry, without getting too complicated, the only defence is, at this stage, the legal defence, well, we've had some success, is to prove to the court that you had an honest and reasonably based belief that you did not have THC in your system. Same law for every other drug, but let's talk about THC. You did not have THC in your system. So some of the examples of that are a fellow who gave evidence that it had been 9 days since he had last smoked a joint. He was believed, and that was found to be reasonable. We've had a recent case about a person who gave us smoking New Year's Eve, the 20th or something of January. She was stopped and positive. She had been visiting on a daily basis a man who had terminal cancer. He was allowed to smoke cannabis, and he took advantage of that, I can say, from the evidence. He lived in a caravan. She spent time with him every day, helping him as a good person, and that was her case. The prosecution said, absolutely impossible, scientifically impossible. We've got these studies, impossible, but the magistrate believed her and found her not guilty. So that's a very recent case. We might quote something from that if we get time later on. But I can talk like one of those people who talks too much. I'm going to pass the microphone now to Sally.
Thank you. Steve's underselling himself. He's run all those matters that have had the successes with honest and reasonable mistake of fact. So I just want to point that out. The only other defence that Steve sort of started to mention but didn't go into too much hasn't yet been tested, and that is the defence of necessity. And it's coming up more and more as a viable defence because of medicinal cannabis in particular. So if you are a lawfully prescribed user of cannabis, the logic is that surely if you're a lawfully prescribed user, it doesn't mean you can never drive again, because without a date and time about how long after use you could drive, and oils, pastes, suppositories, smoking, eating and the like, it's having that effect. The people who are lawfully prescribed are too scared to drive. So I've got a couple of matters that haven't been run yet but are going through the courts looking at necessity as a defence. But they're the only two defences to this type of offending, without going into the boring nature of it, what I'm getting at. It's called a strict liability offence, and that's why they're the only two that are available. So, I'll come to some more as we go through. Here's Andrew.
Okay. The saliva testing. Look, working at the Hemp Embassy, we had a lot of phone calls here and there, and I remember distinctly a while ago, before the introduction, a whistleblower from Health Department rang up and talked about, they're trying to introduce saliva testing all over the world, and read this Rosetta report, and I went and had a read, and we just started, it talks about, the things are unreliable. It couldn't be recommended, all 13 devices that they tested, but and the last paragraph was about a 6-month trial that Victorian Police were starting, and so, we kind of looked at that. But it was a commercial attempt to get saliva testing right around the world, and it seems Australian police were the only ones who took it on. I think it's very important in a lot of these things to question everything, and so we did, and looked at, we always look for a money trail, and sure enough, there is a company down in Victoria that has the exclusive rights to supply Australian police forces with these devices. We did an ASIC search and found, that it had a history, it had name changes, and then a couple of new guys came along, and we suspect they're ex-Victorian police. So, there's all that conspiracy gets thrown into it, but it certainly makes sense. it certainly brings a lot of, it makes it rational, because introducing that regime certainly is irrational. The other thing that we did, cuss and swear at the time, and I was quoted in the New South Wales parliamentary briefings when they were introducing it into New South Wales, that, and the warning came out that direct from the reports, these international reports, that introducing saliva testing would influence drug use trends in your country. Government should be really well aware of the pros and cons, that these devices produce false negatives and false positives, and that police forces would start doing less alcohol testing rather than spending their time on these saliva testing. The second report, the international report, was DRUID, D-R-I-U-I-D, DRUID 1 and 2 reports, and it totally caned the saliva testing. And I suppose we've had questions from the very, very start, which is still really hard to get an answer to. Are police testing, or these devices, you've got to split it up. The devices is one thing. Are they testing for residual delta-9 that's in your mouth, or are they testing for the metabolite that your body produces and can stay in your system for a month or more? We've still never had a clear answer to that, or proof why that would, either way that would be. So, look, for us, we've been heavily involved. If I, and the money trail, like I said, the other side of it is, if I had a company that was selling these devices and there were so many issues about, and questions being raised and that, surely you'd want to, put your evidence out and how good these devices are. That's never ever happened. In fact, the testing of the devices and all, it's all been paid for by basically Vic Roads paying Con Stowe.
Swinburne, yeah.
Yeah, paying Con. Have you met Con?
I'm going to.
Yeah. This was a guy who used to do research on, how much smarter or how much better brain function you'd have by introducing omega-3 and other, dietary supplements that would help a brain and things like that. And it's obvious when people go looking, or, people go looking for a researcher in their area. At the moment, our medical cannabis research doctors are all addiction specialists. They're the only ones who know about cannabis. So when this came up, they found a doctor who'd done research into enhancing brain and stuff using dietary things, and this was, cannabis, omega, so it went that way. And, interesting guy to talk to, but I wouldn't believe what he says. Anyway, I'm going to... But, so, for me, it makes it all rational that it's corruption, and to try and rationalise it, you can go down a rabbit hole.
I emailed Con recently, who's the researcher who back in the early 2000s did the research that led to these schemes, and we're going to meet up at some point, but he said there's a big step between the detectable levels of impairment, but the epidemiological data generally show increased accident risk and or death related to most drugs. And again, it's that kind of sentence where it sounds like it makes sense, but the two do not follow. He's got a causation-correlation problem there. And for a scientist, this is pretty basic stuff, so I thought, that's a bit poor. And the most important question, really, with this is that it's sold to us as a roadside safety scheme. It's sold to us as making the road safer. So the most important question is, does it make the road safer? And we don't have they put out figures and, numbers go down, but it's not clear, because maybe part of that question is the other side, how many people are being removed from the roads they were never impaired, and how does that then affect their lives? And I think, Adela, you might have some stories from the US on how roadside drug testing has affected people in the US, and there's probably similar stories around this room as well, but...
They just really started getting into a lot of the testing. We have rights, though, so they can't just make me do a saliva test. But they could take me to a hospital, and a hospital can take my blood test. Unlike you all, we're not going to go through a fine. You're going to go automatically to jail. All they need is reason they can say they smell cannabis in your car. Once they say they smell cannabis, they have reasonable cause to search your vehicle. Once they search your vehicle, if they find it, you're automatically going to get an impairment. You're going to get possession. They're going to search your car. They're going to confiscate your car. They're going to arrest you, throw you in jail. You're going to have 3 days that you sit in there before you even see an attorney. We have a 99% plea deal nationwide because people want to get out of jail. David Jessup from Arizona was sentenced to a 6-year sentence for cannabis DUI. 6 years of his life, he's now a felon, can't get regular jobs, can never drive, can never have a driving job. You do lose your license, your insurance goes up, and all because, you consent to a search or because you're driving with cannabis. So I advocate on making sure people, due diligence, make sure your cannabis is in the back of your car, never consent to a search. We have an evidentiary hearing. If you don't consent, we can go to an evidentiary hearing and possibly get the charges dismissed, or at least the evidence dismissed. So there's a lot of things that people don't know. You can drive in and out of different states, and you have different compliances that you'll go in and out of, depending on what the states are. If you're within 100 miles of our border from either Canada or Mexico, you're now under federal jurisdiction, meaning you have absolutely no defense to cannabis, which you had mentioned medicinal, a medical necessity defense. I'd also like to argue and urge all countries to start with the biological necessity defense with the discovery of the endogenous endocannabinoid system, so that this defense just isn't related to medicinal purposes, but for recreational purposes, because we all have an endocannabinoid system.
So maybe just because we've touched on it a couple of times, and I know down in Victoria you've got an amendment to the very exciting sounding Transport Legislation Amendment, Better Roads Victoria and Other Amendments Bill 2018. But do you want to tell us a little bit about?
No, thank you. It is exciting, Nick. It's very exciting, and okay, that amendment bill was actually about curbside parking, but I thought it was a great opportunity to bring in random roadside drug testing. Maybe not opposite to the bill at all. However, I did put up amendments, and they were very simple and very specific, that anyone who had a prescription for medicinal cannabis would have an exemption from the testing for the presence of. They would not be exempted from impairment or under the influence if that could be proven that there was reckless driving involved. But it just said that if you had a prescription for medicinal cannabis, then the mere presence of it was not a crime. And that's quite common. If you've got a prescription for Ritalin, if you've got prescriptions for various other substances that may get picked up in roadside testing, the fact that you have a prescription for that substance gives you an exemption to that position. So it's a very simple position, and I think it's so important, and I suspect all of us in this room know of people who have a prescription for medicinal cannabis who are now too afraid to drive. I know of people who've refused a prescription for medicinal cannabis and stayed on opioids or stayed on benzodiazepines because they can still drive. And this is not it's not helpful, nor is it healthy for those people. When I put up the amendment, the government was appalled and shocked and horrified and voted against it. However, what they have given me is they have allowed me to start the conversation with the roadside safety authority. Okay. So that is about that conversation is now starting to happen, and I think there is a movement, and I think this is probably the first step that we will treat medicinal cannabis like any other medicine, and we will exclude it from random testing, which generally isn't random.
So as an aside to those who might have a prescription for medicinal cannabis, there is still that issue of people being caught, removed from the roads when they're not impaired, which could really mess up people's lives, especially if driving is a big part of your job. Wondering, this is open to the panel, but I know that in parts of the US there have been some technologies played with to try and find certain amounts of cannabis and then find a similar correlation that we see with alcohol and motor control. We know, you're probably all aware as well, that it doesn't quite correlate the same way, but maybe some thoughts, some information. What do you think? Do we need a new device to breath test people for cannabis?
I'll just speak really quickly as a politician. I mean, one of our problems is that it's very difficult because of the per se that we do with alcohol. That 0.05 is now, widely believed that equals impairment. But we know with per se testing for THC that doesn't necessarily mean impairment. And I know a number of states have now rallied against that. States in the US have rallied against that notion of per se. I don't know where we're going to go in Australia because we led the charge on alcohol testing. We led the charge in that area. So it's going to take a real rethink for us to look at whether we can do per se. I mean, at least doing per se, which is saying if you have a certain amount of THC in your system, you are then considered impaired. It's better than what we've got now, but I don't think it's actually adequate.
If I could just add a bit to that from what I know about it, which is as lawyers' understanding of science, so bear with me a bit. The 0.05 level, there's a high correlation, study after study after study, full of repeated science that says twice the risk of being involved in an accident if you've got 0.05, 0.08, 0.15, the likelihood of you being involved in an accident increases, and there's a little bit of some pretty good correlation between those numbers. With THC, as Fiona has just said, there is no evidence that I know of, no study I know of, that even attempts to look at what sort of levels, at what sort of level of effect it might have on driving capacity. They're just two separate worlds. So yes, it's not there. My suspicion from hearing from the same expert pharmacologist for the police on many occasions, it's become quite an amusing professional relationship we now have, Dr. Pearl and I. She routinely gives the same scientific report for the government that there's been over half a dozen studies about, sorry to be a bit boring, but this is the stuff that they say. There are half a dozen studies involving THC and driving, and saliva testing, the presence of THC in saliva. And one of them had 4 people involved. The next one had, and they could get results up to about 12 hours or whatever. Then they got about, second they did the same thing with 12 people. Different sort of study, different kind of setup about, they get one joint, they're measured after an hour and so on. People haven't never smoked before or whatever. Another study with people going into rehab, so they've got to hold these people in rehab centres to have their saliva tested and so on. So there's, there were about 20 of them. Altogether, there were about, I think, 44 people in the studies that the government relies on. 44 subjects in, not real life, but in, though in various situations, rehab or whatever. The one they had in passive smoking, they had one case where there were 8 people locked in a van for about 3 hours. Half of them were given a joint each, and other people just had to sit there. Must have been a interesting sort of trip. I don't know if they were driving around or wherever, but Amsterdam, I think this one was. There was an Amsterdam coffee shop one. Half a dozen people. So all these studies, and the scientist says, absolutely, no, they can't possibly have any THC present in their system after maybe 18 hours at the outside. So people who say 2 or 3 days, no. Anyway, but that's the science. That's the science. The science is how much can you detect? How long does it take to detect a minuscule amount, really, of THC in your saliva? The answer seems to be around about 12 hours, and that's it. Nothing about, and the government authority that did a review last year, the National Road Safety Body, whatever they're called, did a review on the subject, did not raise the subject in their report, did not say that they were thinking about looking at the subject of any relationship between what is being tested for and impact on road safety, impact on impairment, relationship between this and that. Who knows what any kind of reading for THC in your saliva means? Who knows in terms of your capacity? If it's high, low, if you're a regular smoker, probably you've got a higher level than people who are not. If you're a regular smoker and a regular driver, you're probably a regular driver in the sense of you're pretty good at it, for goodness sake.
Andrew.
I've been around long enough now to remember seeing the old police test where they put a chalk line on the ground and you had to walk heel to toe or close your eyes and touch your nose and things like that. Now, they might be a little bit antiquated, but the basic principle is to test for impairment, because this whole level of tying impairment to drug levels misses out on the critical thing. I mean, the critical thing in impairment, as well as gross intoxication, is fatigue. For instance, right, you can say drink alcohol, you can wait for your alcohol levels to go, or you can have a bad hangover, you're impaired, right? So it's a very simple matter. We don't want to go back to the chalk lines and touching your nose, but it's a very simple matter with a screen to test someone's reflexes.
I've got the Druid app on my phone.
Too easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's funny that we're talking about impairment with cannabis as she lifted her phone. You're probably more likely to die having people on the road with a cell phone. You talked about safety. Are we really making the roads safer? I think it's ironic.
So on impairment testing, apparently it is a thing that still happens in Australia, very, very irregularly. So the police do have the ability to do impairment testing. I don't know much about it. I have seen some numbers recently that I can give you a vague indication of, because I wasn't meant to reveal the numbers, but of the, I think it's about 60,000 tests that were conducted in Victoria, there were, I think, about 150 impairment tests. So that's probably an indication of when a police officer has seen somebody and gone, no, I think you might actually be dangerous on this road today. So that's a tiny percentage of the overall number of people that are tested and who might return a positive, but police are, and I don't know, you might have, I've failed a couple of drug tests before. I had to go up to Queensland and well, actually I haven't heard from New South Wales yet, so that's nice. None in Victoria, so I keep my home state nice and clean, but the police officer told me both times when I was speaking with them that I'm clearly not impaired, because if I was, they would charge me with something else. But anyway, sorry, going back to I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Where were we? Impairment. Yes, thank you.
If I could return Nick to the room.
I meant that.
It's that short-term memory loss thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Dangerous for
We see
driving
so much of that
microphones.
around.
Oh, we so much.
We absolutely do. Nick's right. There's two separate offences, a different provision of the Act, which is the beauty of Fiona's amendment to just the legislation only about the part of the Act that affects presence of. If the other provision would just stand alone. They don't do the chalk on the road. It's all done on officer observation. You drove through the stop sign. You're driving erratically. The police observe your bloodshot eyes, your crazy speech, your inability to stand up straight. That's when you get done for DUI.
So they don't have a test like that they run you
No, they
through?
don't do anything. It's not like not like you see on TV, or those sort of reality TVs that are not real TVs, because it's all American and whatever and British. No, they don't do that. Well, not in my experience. They probably do occasionally, but that's not the sort of routine thing. It's more on just observation of. And historically, that's the offence that's been around, changed the numbers and so on around, but before they did random testing for alcohol, that's the law. Drive under the influence. So it's kind of the old law. They've added the alcohol rules to that, now the drug testing rules, but that's the old sort of law, and they still use it, reasonably often enough.
So I think we've touched on this a little bit, but it's kind of prohibition via, like, it's a bit of a witch hunt in this way, that it's capturing people who use drugs but aren't necessarily impaired. And let's maybe discuss the random nature of these drug tests. So I volunteer with a program called DanceWise in Victoria. We go to a lot of festivals and provide harm reduction, crowd care. And guess what? There's nearly always a random drug test there.
How
the
random?
police they're quite clear about, yes, it's not that random. We are setting up in these locations, and that it's meant to be for road safety. And they'll come out and put this in the news. Look at how many lives we've saved by getting these druggies off the road. But let's talk about that targeting a little bit. Obviously, up here, I'm not sure what I see news that comes out of here, but how is the program up here? What kind of stories do you hear from people? How random is it?
War stories. I guess, anecdotally and from what I've heard at conventions, and if I can just stop before I forget, and draw your attention to the United in Compassion website. Fiona, you were there too. Ian McGregor gave a great speech. He's a scientist from the Lambert Initiative in Sydney at Sydney Uni. He did a fantastic speech about the testing that they're currently doing for impairment and driving, and how long THC stays in your saliva. It's really worth checking out. when we talk a little bit more about honest and reasonable mistake of fact as a defence, it's worth having done a little bit of research into these kind of things. But
You want that in your Google history, don't you?
you do want that.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So that's United in Compassion. That was a medical cannabis conference a few weeks ago. Just on that, I guess just two things I would say there about the targeting, and that is lads sort of between 18 and 40 years old, particularly driving a ute. They're a favourite of the police, so if you're male, between, teenager to about 40, you're a target. And the other one to be very aware of is that the police in New South Wales certainly have an automatic plate recognition system in the highway patrol vehicles. So I'm finding that a lot of people who have been tested positive, that the police will test them again and again and again because their number plate goes into the system, unlike drink driving, which doesn't have that same, I don't think the plate goes in, but your number plate goes in the ANPR system and you just continue to get tested. So if you're a male, between those ages, particularly in a ute, or if you're in the automatic number plate recognition system, you can expect to be tested. And I've had a client who was driving her cousin's car, and unfortunately he'd been caught for cannabis a few times. She had cocaine in her saliva sample, so she was detected for that. But that was a bit unfortunate.
Aren't you thus then worried about creating a medicinal cannabis program? What's to stop your government then from giving local law enforcement the names and the license plates of the people who would get into the program? So you're like, oh, ding, 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 there's all your patients, and you're just...
Which is why we want the exemption. But I think that's really interesting. When I put the amendments up, they said, oh, well, people would misuse that. And I said, what? They would try and get a prescription for medicinal cannabis so they could use cannabis recreationally. I said, do you have any idea how hard it is to get a medicinal cannabis prescription in this country? It's, it's frivolous and it's stupid that they would run those arguments.
I do want to say that we have a lot of racial profiling in the United States of America. Louisiana, a state of my country, is the prison capital of the world. They have like 7%.
They should have that on their number plates, shouldn't they?
It is. It literally, it's the worst place to be. They have like 7% of African American descent, but they incorporate 90% of the inmates. So yeah, like it's really bad, and obviously dreadlocks, but you're just gonna get. I can't imagine. Is there any protection that you're going to introduce possibly if this happens to protect the patients?
Well, that's what I'm saying, that the amendment would protect anyone with a prescription.
Which just, when it comes to prescriptions, it's been lawful since 2016 for medicinal cannabis in Australia, and it was a very complex system. Has anybody in the room tried to get a script for medicinal cannabis? It's incredibly complex and dysfunctional, the system. So it was one of those give with one hand, take with the other. At least it's getting a little bit more streamlined now, and there's about 4,000 people in Australia who've be 5 now, is it?
5,000 approvals, whether that's patients or... it's about over 5,000 approvals, but we don't know whether that's patients or actual products themselves. So it could be one person on a repeat, things like that, yeah.
I've heard there's 4,000.
Yeah.
Hang on, are we...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have, it sort of goes in two strands. It's sort of loosely two strands to kind of think about. On the one hand, this is how I like to think of it, as a tree diagram kind of thing. On the one hand, you've got the Office of Drug Control, and they tend to administer the licensing, distribution, growing, importation, exportation of medicinal cannabis. That's down that arm. And on the other side, you've got the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and they administer patient access and patient management in the medicinal cannabis scheme.
So that's for medicinal cannabis. Do we know how much the roadside drug testing scheme costs us in Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria? Who can we start with?
Apparently the government doesn't know, because I asked them.
This
And
kind
I
of thing
asked them
worries
in
me.
what's called Accounts and Estimates Committee, and that should have been information that the police commissioner who was in attendance, the police minister who was in attendance, and the various senior public servants who were in attendance, and none of them could tell me.
Interesting.
They had no figure.
And Steve? Hang on. Microphone is the talking.
Yeah,
Steve.
in terms of the money, yeah, like I said, we've chased that a fair bit. PathTech, the company that PathTech Diagnostics, they were just a small company selling disposable lab equipment and rubber tubes and stuff. It's a pretty small company. Yeah, they were less, I think, $1 or $2 million. I think this year they're on track to nearly get $40 million, and that's because you've got just an incredible increase in the use of those saliva tests. Each of those tests are about $50 the government pays, and then you've got the Dragar machines and the consumables, the little fridges that go in the highway patrols. All of that comes through PathTechs, the Winnebagos, which have been modified especially by Path.
You'll be pleased to know they're off the road in Victoria. Yeah. They found that the brakes didn't work. Apparently, the drug testing worked really well, but the brakes not so good. So they've actually had to pull 14 of those multi-million-dollar Winnebagos off the road.
I think there's a deeper story here around drug testing and the industry that supports drug testing in the workplace, the licky sticks, like all of this, but we don't have a huge amount of time, so we won't get into that, but I just want to, that is a conversation that needs to be happening a lot more, especially with the encroachment of workplace drug testing into workplaces where it's not clear that being impaired at the computer is going to be, and it's, again, not about impairment anyway, and then you're getting this kind of Orwellian weird thing where corporations are kind of putting themselves forward as like, oh, no, but we're going to help you get better. If you take drugs on the weekend, well, we want you to live a healthy lifestyle to be an optimal employee for us and that. But we won't get into that. I want to get some questions. So any hands? Oh, yes, Adela. Grab the mic.
I just blanked out. I was about to ask. Is this program available, like, if I created the drug test, is this something that we're bidding for, the government? Do you give this contract, and is it annual? Because you could find out some of the costs that way.
Yeah, if we had the same public tendering process that most of the US states have, we would understand that, but we don't have a public tendering process, and particularly around police equipment. Police equipment is very much a in-house case, and it opens a lot of questions for that.
I have another question. Can you record them drug testing you legally?
Of course.
And you could post it up without violating any of your rights? Okay.
Yep,
here, I'm coming with a microphone, please wait. Who are you pointing to?
Just before that...
Back here?
On the way to the first question, just to correct that last, legally you cannot in New South Wales record audio without the permission. You can video the police. They will all have body cam now. They've got all this equipment. They're like RoboCops more and more. But they'll have recording. If you want to keep the recording, just tell the cop you want to keep that recording, please, and they will keep it.
And you can do visual.
Yeah. You can do visual, yeah.
First question.
If you get pulled over, you go positive, that test, they send it away. Do they actually take a DNA sample of that as well and record that against you? Because I've got suspicion they have.
They could, but they don't. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that they do. There's no, they don't.
Okay, we're coming around for another
They've got to be
question
charged
here.
with a major crime to have DNA taken, isn't it?
Well, it depends what state you're in.
There's a process. There's a legal process to get your DNA if you're charged with certain offences and so on. So they can take you to court. This is the legal structure. So if they want your DNA, they can do that. But in terms of police database having the entire citizenry's DNA on a database, they'd love it, but they don't have the authority to do that. And I doubt very much whether it's Orwellian as all that they're using these samples. It's pretty routine. There's 100,000 a year. The New South Wales government, in terms of the cost, just organised, I don't know how the contract is organised, if they're paying it all up front or what, but 300,000 tests over a 3-year period. Each of the swab kits themselves cost $60 per swab, plus there's the police time of dealing with them, the police time of hanging around, stopping drivers who are going to test negative, etc., as well as the positive ones, or the court time. It's a very large expense, and for people who think it might be a revenue raiser, it is absolutely not a revenue raiser. It's costing them a bucket.
Yes, we've got lawyers on the stage defend and prosecute, politicians pass the laws, police enforce the laws. Do you ever get tested during your job? And will you ever?
Yeah. No,
and I'm talking about the police as well.
And I think police are tested. I am not tested, and I'm not tested. And in fact, we actually had a debate about this 5 years ago, whether we should be tested, particularly around alcohol. But I know also from the profiling, I was driving to an interview and I was stopped by a random alcohol and drug testing unit in Melbourne, and they tested me for alcohol. They didn't test me for drugs because I was wearing a suit. Ha ha.
So the moral of the story is always keep a suit jacket in the back seat.
Just
get that on.
On that, I've been stopped and I had to ask to be tested for drugs because I actually wanted to go through the process. So many of my clients do. So it returned a negative result at the roadside, and I asked if they would then take me into the bus so I could see the Dragar. And there's a bit of a question mark about the storage facilities after the test. So that second test is called the Dragar 5000 machine, and that's on the bus or at the cop shop. So I wanted to go through the process, and B, see how they were storing the tests at the other end. But the police refused to take it any further, and the Ballina police, of course, now know me and go away, so I could almost pretty much have a big scoob and drive straight through and I wouldn't get tested.
Adela, yeah.
I have a question. Is there anything that will protect people from the government, maybe like you just mentioned storage, or can you all keep this as DNA and sell it to companies later? Is there something that might happen in the future?
I don't know about that, but the storage I was talking about is about whether or not it actually affects that test result and whether it's being stored at a certain temperature. So I don't know about the DNA aspect, maybe Steve does, but I'm just talking about the storage. There could be an action in there somewhere, a successful defence, but I'd really like to get in and find out if they're just putting it in an esky, and apparently that's not being stored properly.
Further questions, Kath?
Well, I was just going to also, I think this is true, maybe you know. So in the US, they can't actually, this whole random stuff that goes on does not happen in the US, right? As in you have to, for instance, be driving badly or...
Not true.
Not true.
Not true. Actually, my state in Missouri, they actually just passed medicinal. And on 419 and on 420, the state troopers and all of the highway patrol were actively stopping people for drug driving, specifically for cannabis. I did not go anywhere.
I have two questions. Firstly, there are a number of people who are taking CBD oil for therapeutic reasons, and it has supposedly no or very, very little THC. Would that show up on a driver drug test?
The science on that's hard, but I'd like to ask a question. Does anyone here aware that we can get access to the test and be testing ourselves so we can have a personal level?
The company...
Because that would answer your question very well.
The police use a SureTech, the one
SecureTech.
Secure. The one the police use is not the one you can buy. They have all the other ones. You can buy them, but not that one. And I believe you can buy a Dragar 3000, but you can't buy a Dragar 5000.
Can I just make a comment on that? I think it's when I've spoken to prescribing doctors, they feel that they must advise their patient not to drive. I think that the chances of that patient failing a saliva test would be very low. However, if that patient was to be in a car accident, then the blood testing or urine testings that might go on after that may put that patient in. So doctors are, I think, pretty much saying to anyone who is prescribed that driving's
No, that is a condition.
To be considered.
That is a condition. You cannot use the use of this. And it's not really a prescription either. I really hate that we use that word all the time. If you have a look at the wording on the documents that you're given, if you do get some of this cannabis, it's not a prescription. It's an experimental drug that this doctor is trying on you. It's unregistered. It's unlicensed anywhere in the world, and you cannot use the use of this as a defence if you get caught driving. So I think, but police can circumvent that again just by, we believe that they ask people, are you using cannabis, or and if the person says, well, I use it for medical purposes, the cops say, are you prescribed? And the patient says yes, and they just simply don't test them. And so, but at a corporate level, I mean, all these companies wanting to do medical cannabis, I mean, why would you spend all that money if your patients are going to, eventually, if the product you're making is going to make patients lose their licence? I think there's still a lot of ambiguity and confusion about, medical cannabis, these devices. As I said, you've heard my rave on it right from the start. It's just corruption. So trying to rationalise any argument around it is sort of, it's this rabbit hole. But suffice to say that the laws were written knowing that, they were going for the per se zero. Saliva, urine and blood tests were developed scientifically. We have an Australian standard cut-off for what a positive test for THC. And all of that just got left behind. When they brought the laws in, there was no hemp seed food. It was still illegal. Hemp seed food, legally, there are maximum allowable limits of THC and CBD in hemp seed food. That issue still has not been put to bed. State authorities have still yet to get their legislation and regulations and enforcement around hemp seed food, where a New South Wales health or food or health inspector can go to a shop, have a look at all these hemp seed foods, have a look for a number of things, that there's no hemp leaf on the product, that there's no mention of THC or CBD, and that if they test the food, that it will not exceed the MAL, the maximum allowable limit of THC or CBD. As far as we know, government departments around the country are doing a survey at the moment of all the different government departments that have anything to do with hemp and hemp seed food, asking them what they're doing now. There's these really obscure federal departments. One's called SEA space WG. It's a working group. But yeah, so they're still trying to get that up and going. But the stumbling block is, as was for about 8-9 years while Australia was, while they were trying to get hemp seed food legal, was that police at a state level were influencing whole of government's responses to Canberra about the approval of the food. Hemp seed food wasn't approved because governments wanted it to. Hemp seed food was approved because they couldn't stop it from being approved. They exhausted every avenue to stop it. It got through, it was approved in May 2017. By November 2017, that's when food was allowed to be sold. But in that 6-month period, those state governments were supposed to get their regulations in order. We're still not, I imagine we're still a long way away from that.
Did you say you had a second part to your question?
Yes. Let's say it's been a while since you had a joint. You think there might be a tiny bit of residual THC in this system. Is there any way of beating the test? I hear about people cleaning their teeth or having lemon juice or, all sorts of different things. It might just be conjecture from a lot of people. Is there any research on that?
There's no research, but there's a number of N=1s. I've just had a nice feedback from an N=1 coming into town today, heavy smoker with a recent ingestion with the apple cider vinegar wash. So I don't want you to rely on it, but there's an N=1 of effectiveness. What I wanted to ask Andrew, your upcoming trial, can you give us an update on that, and how can we help?
Look, I'm being represented in that one. I was targeted. It's my second time around. I was targeted. I went to a cafe in town. I left. Undercover cops straight onto me, pulled me over. They went for the breath test and then straight for the saliva test. They asked if I'd been using cannabis. I said no. They said, we just saw you at a cafe, we walked by and we could smell cannabis. I said, well, I get exposed to a lot of cannabis in Nimbin. I'm around it all the time. And by chance, I own one of the biggest hemp seed food companies in the country. I grow hemp. No, it doesn't matter. They just really wanted to do that. So in this time, the first time I represented myself, this time I'm being represented by Steve and his excellent associate. Really looking forward to, trying to express, I suppose, for me, we just have so much going on. My raves are so long, but trying to, push the debate along, and if we can get a bit of a win in court that, on a point that I might find obscure, but a judge might find, really relevant in it all. Ultimately, I still just want to tell the judge, hey, this is just corruption. There's nothing. And when we talk about, medical cannabis in that respect and the development of these devices, they couldn't get cannabis. Just like we can't get cannabis for medical and scientific research, just like doctors and politicians and medical professionals say there's not enough research that's been done, it's still that bottleneck. But when Con Stowe wanted to do the saliva testing to bring these devices into Australia, they went to the one lawful source of cannabis for medical and scientific research in the world, and that's NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, which supplied them with joints. The genetics, the lawful genetics that make these lawful around the world, back then was owned by Monsanto. They always have for 45 years. They've owned these genetics, and they grow them every second year at the University of Mississippi. And if any government, researchers and whatever from around the world want a lawful source, they go to NIDA. The thing about NIDA is they only supply and fund research into the negative consequences of its use, not medical beneficial purposes. So, there's still such a long, long way to go around the entire debate. I mean, even when we talk about medical, just quickly, and just so people, maybe shift your thinking on this. Governments don't own cannabis. All they can do is talk about changing laws that would allow companies to come and develop these drugs, a situation that's not happened anywhere in the world. And we're expected, and we're going by on the assumption that the rest of the world has left the door open for Australian companies. And look, when you look at the details about what's happening in the US and Canada and Israel and the Netherlands, everything is not what it appears. And although it might appear that everything's kosher in the Netherlands, the fact is it's illegal under the federal law. Same in the US. Whatever you're seeing there, it's illegal under federal law. Canada's been dragged kicking and screaming on medical cannabis. The oils that we're bringing over from Canada now, which are getting cheaper, and obviously are going to affect any Australian company's ability to compete. But these products, the Canadian government was trying to stop those products. In 2015, the Canadian government lost a High Court challenge. They were insisting that if you want to use cannabis for medical purposes, you have to smoke high THC cannabis. The High Court found...
Sorry, I was going to say, just before we continue on, I know that we're getting close on time. Is guidance...
Can I just quickly say, United in Compassion, just to reiterate what Jenny said, United in Compassion and the Lambert Institute's work and Ian McGregor's work in particular on this is very useful, and I would recommend going and having a read of that. It's really great work on saliva tests and, the sort of after so many hours and what you've taken and what you've eaten and etc.
I bet it'd be just interesting to see what cannabis they got and where did they get it from, and whether it was individual molecules or that kind of...
I hope that there's one thing we all learn from this today, is that unless we all take individual action and start writing to your parliament or your representatives or voting actively, that none of this is going to change. If we sit idly by and allow the government and allow the bureaucracy and the police department and to continue to do these things without being upset, without recording it every time, without sharing the injustices, without sharing your story, this is going to continue to happen. If you share your stories, you guys can stop this from happening to the rest of the world. Let people know that this is happening and be prepared that this could happen in other countries. So share your story, take action, write your representatives, call them, take a picture and send it to this beautiful lady and let everybody know that we're not going to allow this tyranny and this genocide to continue to happen.
We've got a little bit more time for some questions, but I want to just remind you that this is being recorded for a radio show that I do on 3CR in Melbourne. You can also access the podcast at the website, which is 3cr.org.au, if you want to pass this conversation on to a friend or something like that, because as Adela says, that part is important, contacting your MPs. The other part, speak to your friends, speak to your family about it. Speak to people in your community who might not be clear on what's going on, because the road safety message is the message that they're pushing out there. That's the message that they want to get stuck, and it's the they don't talk about the fact that they're not detecting impairment. They just correlate the two. They just say these are all impaired drivers. So you need to meet that message and remind the people around you that actually that's not what's going on. And people might eye roll you a little bit at first, but there are plenty of resources out there, and maybe if anyone has any resources that you can tell us about now, online especially, where people could go and get some information about how this works to pass on to your friends, to your family, colleagues, etc. Does anybody have any? I think we had one mentioned before, but any other good resources?
Look, I think we should get back to questions, but if I could just add to that.
Yes.
There is a case coming up for a near and dear friend of some of us, Michael Balderstone, the president of the Hemp Embassy, has somehow or other, surprising to all of us, fallen foul of this particular legislation. He shouldn't be driving so much, but anyway, he did. So we're running a case, which is, jokes aside, we're running a case about the reasonableness of the law. We're taking a different approach on that case. And our legal argument will be in terms of a administrative law, powers of Parliament and stuff kind of argument, which is very tedious to talk about in a way, that the law is effectively invalid. We expect to lose in the Magistrates' Court. We think our case is reasonably sensible as a lawyer, so we might appeal to the Supreme Court. The main point of why we're doing it is to draw attention to the law, to put that argument in a public place. We're going to be going public about this kind of now. Michael's given me permission to talk about his case, I should say, for ethical reasons. Anyway, so we're about to get some. The case is not till the end of June, so we want to sort of think about the staging of it. But there will be an argument in the public place, particularly if you go to the Supreme Court. Probably 2 stages. You know, the publicity continues for more than a few months, so hopefully we'll be able to bring the public's attention to just how unjust really the impact of this law is.
I want to ask a question of the 2 lawyers, if that can be answered.
And then...
I mean, it's a question someone would ask. There's always an issue in court, right, and there's a dilemma, and we face this with the medical suppliers, between pleading not guilty and fighting it, and pleading guilty and taking the discount that comes with that. Like, basically, I was confronted with a positive saliva test, and I said to the magistrate, he said, how do you plead? I said, I'm pleading not guilty, but I want a Section 10. And he said to me, well, you can't get a Section 10 unless you plead guilty. So I said, OK, I'm guilty. I'm pleading guilty. I want a Section 10. And he said, you can have it. It was like a farce.
What's Section 10, quickly?
Section 10 is facts proven, no conviction recorded. Therefore, no loss of licence and things like that. Okay?
I'm just saying, so no loss of licence, that's the significance of it.
Say again?
No loss of licence, no conviction,
yeah.
so you keep your licence.
What's your advice?
Conviction's
to
a technicality,
because
either way.
It puts people in a dilemma between doing what's right morally and ethically and what's right from a personal protection point of view.
Probably someone in the audience has got a question as well, but I'll say very quickly, it depends on the personal circumstances. Running the defence available of honest or reasonable mistake involves more time and cost and delay. It takes months and a bit of stress. Not easy going to court, even if you've got a good case. Never easy to go to court, let me tell you for a fact. So not many people want to do it. Secondly, you'd have to have an argument that makes some sense. A lot of people, most people, typical case, Lismore Local Court on a Monday, 5 or 6 of these every week. Typical case is 2 or 3 days since had the smoke, got a pretty good record, da-da-da. That's it. That's all the police say anyway in terms of what's discussed. So most people plead guilty because what are you going to do? You know, if it's your first offence, you get off. If it's not your first offence, you don't get off. But what else are you going to do?
Just on that,
other than have this really, really complicated legal argument that unless you can prove that you had a reason to think that you had no THC present in your saliva, a reason to think that, and you had, and that was honestly held. So not just bullshitting, you're telling the truth. And you'll have an expert on the other side who says the science says not possible after 12 hours. Person telling a lie, don't believe them.
Sally?
Because the science says this, they must be lying.
And
sorry, just because things are actually probably going to get worse before they get better. In New South Wales in May this year, the legislation's changing so that if you are detected as low-range PCA drink driving or under Section 111, this offence of having cannabis and oral fluid sample, you'll lose your licence for 3 months. There's no court attendance notice. You won't be going through that process. You'll simply be detected, second test, the test down at FAS at the forensic analysis in Sydney will come back and you'll simply get a notice that you've lost your licence for 3 months and you've been fined. So you will be convicted. So at least at this stage, people are going to court, and one of the big upsides to pleading guilty is that you get, if you plead guilty early enough, you will get an automatic sentencing discount of 25% in New South Wales. So the magistrate will say, thanks very much for not wasting the court's time. You've entered a guilty plea nice and early, a couple of references, no priors, you're not messing us around, we'll give you 25% sentencing discount. Whereas if you plead not guilty and lose, you don't get any discount. So that's one of the upsides. So just also, bear in mind law change in New South Wales from May.
question.
Thanks for a fascinating discussion. At the risk of going down another rabbit hole, I just wanted to pick up on something that Andrew Katelaris mentioned at the start. Can you, or does anyone know, to clarify, if the aim of the roadside testing is safety, can I be chock full of legal opiates and benzodiazepines, or is that detected as well on the roadside test?
The purpose of the testing is not safety. Now, even the police admit that it's not an impairment test at this stage, it's a compliance test. And it's one more big giant step towards pharmaco-fascist system that we're being forced to live in. I don't know what the situation is with medical opiates. I presume you just have to...
That was a good word, pharmaco-fascist. Just put that one in your brain for later.
Well, look, what is pharmaco-fascism? It's banning the quality plant drugs and pushing the synthetic drugs.
Well, actually, we didn't, sorry to interrupt everyone for a second, but we didn't quite touch on, we touched on that a little bit, the sort of unintended consequences of this. And I've seen from the perspective of going along to the festivals, that the trends of the drugs that people are taking at a lot of the festivals across Victoria have shifted. So people aren't smoking cannabis as much, they're not taking MDMA, but instead they're having things like GHB or one of its analogues, or ketamine, cocaine. Those three in particular actually
synthetic
seem to be
synthetic cannabinoids.
Well, yes, the synthetic cannabinoids were a big deal, especially for the workplace drug testing.
Synthetic don't show, cocaine.
And these are the
Cocaine
unintended
does show up
consequences. People don't stop getting high because of that. They just find a different way to get high. And is that good? Is that bad?
I think going back to the question, when we ask these questions of the police, they will come back with a statistic which is that 70%, I think was the statistic they gave to me, of road fatalities. When they did their drug testing, they said in 70% of the cases of road fatalities or serious injury, drugs were detected. Now, when you actually break that down, and you look at most serious road injuries occur with generally young men between 18 and 25, and when you look at the prevalence of drug use in our community, it's young men between 18 and 25. So I don't think there has been any really good research that would answer your question. What we're seeing is 2 and 2 and getting 5.
There was a little bit of research because the Rosetta project and the Druid reports, they were done in Europe, and they actually were testing for other drugs as well, especially on sensitivity. But opiates, benzos, and I think another one of the pharmaceuticals, were the most reliably detected by the devices. And cannabis was still the most subjective one too. So, it really is, but again, it was a warning that governments were given, and why most governments, by and large, most all governments never took on saliva testing, or the strategy was that it would influence drug use trends in a negative way. And more recently I see, the pill testing strategy. Look, it's a great idea and everything, but while you're still going to have sniffer dogs and saliva testing, and just have now pill testing, of course, more kids, more young folk, more people are just going to go to drugs that
it is a bit like you've broken your arm, bone sticking out there. Let me hand you a band-aid.
Yeah.
Give it a little band-aid.
If you're a young entrepreneur,
grab the mic.
Use the mic, Adela.
I guess the good news is if you're a young entrepreneur or an entrepreneur, there's a niche that needs to be filled. So
there is a niche, and I know the companies that are doing it, and I consider it a little bit. I don't know. There's in Victoria we've got. Maybe I shouldn't name names. I don't know. They sell tests because and they're $20 or $30 a test, so that people will test before going out. Very lucrative business because they can make 100-200% markup on it, huge money in it, and now they've got the whole festival scene in this kind of habit of like, we'll go and do the test. So they're making money off this shitty situation. Just feels a little, and they're not putting it back into the community or anything like that. It's a very profitable thing for this young entrepreneur.
Or like a lozenger that'll help you pass the drug test. But this is horrible, right? So we're having to create gray areas and loopholes so that because you used a plant, that's crazy to me. But take action is really all it really boils down to.
Another question?
Yeah, we've let's do two more. So this is the second last one.
Thank you. You mentioned racial profiling, and Australia is expert level at that. This is a penal colony. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Australia, a lot of legal aid organisations or just help for people, support, the only way they can get funding is if the people plead guilty every time. And so sometimes they are given a trade-off, lose one thing that probably didn't exist anyway and take that one, take the rap for that. And with regard to DNA testing, you don't actually need to test everybody in the whole country, because once you have one person's DNA, then you have a record for their cousin and other family members, especially if you're a minority group. Is that right?
Yeah. Does anybody have... That was just, is that right? I have no idea. I guess so. Ask a geneticist.
I've been given the microphone. I've got no idea either. Sorry, it's difficult to. It's difficult to say honestly about some of those situations. There's a lot of suspicion. Our Adela visiting from across the ocean is no doubt gobsmacked about how much lack of transparency she's heard about on the panel tonight. Even members of Parliament can't find out what's going on, for goodness sake. There's just so much we don't know. The way that our legal system, our political system is structured, there's so much. We don't even know who gets to lobby government until about a year later. Then they say, we had a meeting with the minister, a year ago. Oh, great. Anyway, it's just impossible to find out. So understandably, people have suspicions about what government does, but I can't really say beyond that.
So, by the way, things are sort of like getting together for the Combi Convoy. So we're going to have one last question and then that's all happening. Oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to have two. Marie has been waiting. Bob's going to do one first.
Yeah, I believe this is a saliva test. So you may put a thing in your mouth that actually cuts at a cellular level and it is full of chemicals. So who is a copper to make you do that? When it's not sterile, it's been dragged around in a car, in and out of police stations and wherever. So can you just spit on this thing, or do you have to go through their protocol?
I can speak a bit. The way it works, Bob, is the thing is it's in a sealed alfoil bizzo. It's sterile. Then they bring it out and they tear it in front of you. And then they take it apart. There's two parts, all right? The reagents... Again, you've got to go back. It's an American company that makes the reagent, and it's a German company that made the delivery device. In the handle part,
globalism.
So the bit that goes in your mouth, okay, it's sterile. It's just pulling a bit of there's these two little ramps, and as you drag it, it takes the saliva up onto these two pads, which then make an indication whether there's enough saliva there. There's two parts to the handle of it, and the officer has that away, but once he puts them together and cracks them shut, it breaks the vials of reagents, which shoots them up onto the pad where your saliva test in, and then they wait for the reaction or the reagent to do its thing. So, if anything, it's on the police. Now, as a hemp grower, years ago, we tried to get these reagents to do in-field hemp testing. Andrew, you could probably speak about the toxicity of reagents. Yeah, very toxic. Like, for us to use them, we'd need goggles and gloves and overalls. These cops are holding them in their hand. I'm assuming it's safe, but, you know, there could be an accident. I'm sure there's some kind of procedure for them to get rid of those devices once they're spent in a very safe way and contained manner. Just as I said, there's just questions all over this. Yeah.
And I think because you can deny and say, I'm not going to do that, but I think our lawyer friends can tell you what happens next when you do that. So you can deny it. What happens next? I'm not doing that. Yeah.
You get arrested, there's no doubt about that. I've stood up to them, you know, you get 5 minutes of monosyllabic answers where they just wave this at your face and then they start rattling the handcuffs.
And the power to take the sample comes from the legislation. The police have the power to do that, and it's an offence to not comply with that. The word random appears in the title of that section. It is not the words of the section itself. So the police have the power to stop and require a swab for saliva swab for any reason. That's not, the word random doesn't appear. So that argument, oh, that's not really random, they're picking on me, probably they are, but it's not unlawful for them to pick on you.
And
more. One to Steve Bolt, please. Steve, hi. Okay, one of your most recent cases in the Lismore court that involved a woman saying I had not taken any form of smoke, yet I showed positive, and Dr. Pearl was put on the stand, if I understand it correctly, and she started talking about that capsules or oil was not showing up in roadside drug testing. Can you please speak to that?
Yes, that's true. Dr. Pearl, the government pharmacologist, said that it's a bit sciencey. Her argument is that the consensus of scientific opinion is that THC remains in saliva only as a residue of what you've smoked or eaten in a cookie or whatever, okay? That it does not come back from your system. So therefore, once the saliva in your mouth is gone, which she says is around about 12 hours or so at the time of your consumption, there should be no more THC. So that's an argument, okay? So that's what she's arguing about. But in the course of evidence, because we ramble on in court sometimes, just like we do in the Nimbin Town Hall, and the magistrate was interested and asked her a few questions, and I asked her nothing to do with anything, we were just asking her questions. On another occasion, I might just interrupt this story, on another occasion we were just having a similar sort of rambling conversation, and she made the observation that she was on the committee that led to the introduction of this rule in New South Wales 15 years ago or whatever. She said she was against it. It was all just nonsense. It's nothing to do with road safety. Everyone else on the committee, whoever they were, not named, whoever else was on the committee said, oh no, it's good, we'll cut down on pot smoking, we'll do it for that reason. Anyway, this is by the way. So in this particular case though, she said that it's not possible. If you took cannabis by a capsule, THC in a capsule, and swallowed without the capsule opening in your mouth, or used it as a suppository, which the magistrate, you and I didn't, was called shelving. Anyway, if you take cannabis without putting it in your mouth, would not lead to any saliva being exposure of your saliva to THC, therefore would be zero.
But the sad thing,
the magistrate made the comment in his judgment against that evidence, basically, or against the real part of the case was, could she rule out? She said impossible for a passive smoker. This is a passive smoking case. Impossible for a passive smoker to have any THC in their system after about an hour or two, maybe a couple of hours, probably 20 minutes, but maybe a couple of hours. So therefore, the woman was lying. Right? Anyway, that was the main part of the case. In the judgment, the magistrate commented that the consequence of the government's official position is it depends how you take the stuff. Whether you are going to test positive or not, it depends how you take the stuff. Shove it up your bum, go ahead, my friends, and you will not, according to the government expert, test positive to a saliva test in New South Wales. Believe it or not. That's
good place to end on.
Yeah.
Sorry,
not
very punny, but thank you all for coming this afternoon. As you've seen, this is a much longer and broader discussion with a lot of little tidbits that we could go off on. If you want to hear some of those discussions, 3cr.org.au, follow the links to Enpsychedelia, and you can go and hear some other discussions with a lot of the people here. If you're in New South Wales, check out what David Shoebridge is doing. I'm not sure what other MPs are up to as well, but I know that David works hard on these sorts of issues. And write to your local member as well. Speak to your friends, speak to your family, speak to your colleagues about these issues and find the facts. I'd like to thank our panellists this afternoon as well. Andrew, Sally, 2 Andrews, 1 Sally, 1 Steve, a Fiona and an Adela. Thank you.
And thank you, Nick. The Hemp Embassy also has a wonderful YouTube channel, the Hemp Embassy YouTube channel. It has all of these great talks on it. So for the past 4 years, Pancho's been slaving away here, and we've got a lovely little editing team that even travel from overseas to help us. So yeah, just check out all the talks, and at least within 2 weeks of this event, all these talks will be up online as well. So simply go to YouTube and, type in Hemp Embassy.